So in this video, I'm going to show you how I refinish this mid-century modern coffee table. As a general rule of thumb, I do not like refinishing things, nor wouldn't say I dislike mid-century modern, but it's not really my go-to style. The reason I refinished this is because this coffee table was my grandparents', and I actually liked them a lot, so that is why I have this, and I kept it and I put the effort into it. It's more about memories versus aesthetics. So this process is similar to any sort of refinishing process, but I do want to give people a couple tidbits of information so I don't forget to mention them in the video. Mid-century modern furniture is pretty easy to spot. It's very distinct. There's a lot of hallmarks that kind of jump out at you. So this is going to have a hardwood edge. The legs are also hardwood. It looks like it might be ash. So then it's going to have a veneered top as well. This one is walnut, as well as the front is veneered lattice work. So if you strip this down like I did, which you'll see in the video, and then try to stain it, you'll have a very distinct two-tone look, because the ash is going to look very different no matter what color you choose against the walnut. So I found an article that describes the furniture, someone who refinishes this professionally and gets it to look like its original state. I decided to keep it this two-tone look because I liked the way it looked. It lightened up the piece a lot, and it lightened up the room it's sitting in a lot as well. But if you want to revive this furniture, that article will kind of send you in a different direction than I went, because all this furniture, people think it was oiled. It wasn't. It was a toned finish that was sprayed on it, which makes sense. The tone of the finish will make the coat of this look uniform versus potentially staining it. And definitely if you put oil on this, it will look two-tone as well. So that is going to be my process. I realize this look is not for everybody, but this is one of those rare videos where this is my personal coffee table, so I finished it the way I wanted it to be finished. So this should be a pretty quick video. It's only going to be one video of not a multiple series, and I also had to do quite a bit of repair work on the base because this table, actually my cousin had it for a little bit and it lived through Hurricane Sandy. So when his home flooded, these legs are laminated and they started to delaminate, so there was a lot of fixing. The drawer box was also messed up, so there's also going to be some repair work in this video, not just stripping and refinishing the piece. So this is what the table looked like when I got it. The top is actually quite damaged. It's a little hard to see in the video because of the glare. The box that holds up the drawer was completely apart, and the base of the legs had delaminated. There's a middle poplar spline that goes through the legs that was missing in some spots, and part of the dowels were also broken. You can see from the video, mid-century modern, it's kind of a two-tone look as it is, but it's it matches, it's more subtle. So the bottom of this veneer is actually poplar on the bottom, which is very common in furniture. They're not going to put an expensive veneer where you're not going to see it. So the first thing I had to do was remove some hardware my cousin had put in here. As a general PSA to people, putting hardware into joints like this just does nothing more than compromise the furniture more. If you have something falling apart, put some glue in there or whatnot. It's a much better fix. So this came apart pretty easily. You could see one of these legs was completely separated because the legs were only attached to the top by these cleats, which I'm also replacing because there was a ton of hardware in them to the point where they were starting to splinter. And even though this furniture is newer than, say, some antiques, the glue's still not as good as modern glues, so it pops apart pretty easily. The one spot I'm using stripper, and this is an eco-friendly stripper, is on the lattice work. That's just because it would have been very hard to sand it. This is walnut, that inner lattice work, so it's not going to really change the color, but because I knew I was going to be putting a different finish on this than the finish that was on it, I wanted it to all match. So I didn't really know what to expect with this, so I just put 80 grit sandpaper
on the orbital sander, and I was quite amazed with how quickly all the finish came off. If you watch the channel, you know I'm used to refinishing much older pieces of furniture, older doors with multiple types of varnish and finish on them and layers of paint. So this was a pleasant surprise how easily this finish came off. I had all this off in an afternoon, whereas other pieces would take days. You could see I took this down to bare wood very quickly. This central veneer you're going to want to be careful with because you're going to be able to sand through it extremely quickly. As soon as you get that sheen off, it's pretty much done. Then this one corner, a dog turned this into a chew toy in this corner, so I just evened that out a little bit with the orbital. You could see right in the corner I'm going to point at it is where I went too deep. That's where I just pointed. You could see the poplar underwood showing through. So just be careful with this, with how hard and aggressive you get with the sander. I flipped this over and sanded the edges, and then it was time to start taking these legs apart. As you can see, I wanted to replace the dowels in these because they were compromised, the ones that were broken, but also sanding this is going to be much easier on flat pieces. So like I said, this glue is not as good as modern glues. If there was Type Bond 3 in there, you would have never been able to get this apart without breaking it. But it was easy enough to pop apart. If you get a little bit of a crack showing through, you can get a chisel in there and pry it off, and then you could see I could refinish all parts of the legs very easily because now they're flat pieces and I don't have to get in a ton of curves, and I could sand those down as well. So this is that lighter blondish wood, which I believe is ash. To start gluing these back together, I'm going to pry open these laminates as much as possible without breaking them. I don't want to completely take these apart and get as much glue in that joint as possible. You'll see I'm very, I don't conserve the glue in this video. I want to get this glue in as much of these joints as possible. I kind of put it on everything, and then I could put these back together and clamp these overnight. And then I want to do this obviously before I sand these because the sand will take off all of the glue spill out that comes out. Now some of this middle spline, which is poplar, was missing, so I was able to save as much as possible to make up the difference. I happen to have some 1/16 inch oak veneer. If I doubled it up, it was about the same thickness, and while the oak will not match the poplar, it was only, I think, 2 or 3 little spots, and they're the splines, so unless you get down on the floor and really stare at the table, you're not going to be able to notice the difference. So I just glued that veneer together, and I kind of shoved it in the edge where there was a piece missing, and then I could also clamp this whole thing together. So that's how I went about replacing the spline material that was lost. Now there were a couple spots where there were still some holes, and I'll show you how I deal with that later. But like I said, these clamps and this glue will set up overnight. Could come in the next day and finish this whole thing up. So like I said, there's a couple little spots where I just couldn't get enough material. So all I did was I took some sawdust I had around the shop, I mixed it with some glue, and you basically make your own wood filler, and I could apply it into these little, there was, like I said, a couple of these as well, and it will fill the spline, and when you go to finish the piece, you can barely tell that there was a hole there. And then the next day I could come in and take the clamps off, and then I could sand these as well. So there's going to be, these won't fit back together perfectly, so that's one of the reasons I waited to sand these till afterwards. Also, this still has somewhat of a shiny finish on it, so the glue won't really stick to that surface, so it was easy to take all that excess glue off. The parts where I added splines was also simple. I just used a saw to cut off the excess, and then I would be able to go through and sand this down. I'm trying not to speed up these clips as best as possible so that you could really see what I'm doing in case you have a piece of furniture like this and want to repair it yourself. But I'm just taking off those excess pieces, and then once I sand this, you'll be barely able to tell that there was a repair there. For the stripper that I let sit up overnight, this is kind of the way I like to do this. I put some sawdust on there. It absorbs all of the stripper. Now this one's not toxic. It's a grain stripper. And you can see I'll put multiple coats up there. It will absorb all of that liquid so it doesn't make a gooey mess. And then I could go through and sand the edges of this because the frame of this drawer is also that ash. So these were the original cleats holding that on, and I'm going to make mine a little different. They're going to be pretty much the same length, but they're going to be a little bit wider so that I have more surface area to glue not only into the legs but also the tabletop. So I was able to save some of the dowels on these, but the ones I couldn't, all I did was use a doweling jig to re-drill out those holes. If you don't have a doweling jig, I've done stuff like this before freehand, but you have to have a pretty steady hand in order to do this because it has to line up with the holes that are already in the legs. So I used a doweling jig. These were 3/8 inch holes and 3/8 inch pins. Make sure the new ones fit, and then I could start putting this stuff together. So the new cleat, you could see where the old holes were. I'm putting a little glue on there, and then I just bradded this into place with some brads. And then I'm decided to attach mine with dowels as well. So I'm going to drill through the piece. I have a little stopper on the drill bit, so I get a pretty straight hole using the dowel jig, and then it's straight enough that I could finish it into the piece. And then I'm going to put dowels in there. The thing about hardware and thin pieces of wood like this is any stress you put on the table, lifting it, moving it, is a chance for that hardware to rip through the piece. So instead of reattaching this with screws, I decided to use dowel pins, which is what I'm doing here. And then I hammered these just enough to keep them exposed because this is the underside of the table. You're not going to see it, and I do kind of like the way it looks. So those are the 4 legs in place. And then, like I said, these are the ones I replaced. You could see after years of repairs, they just start to completely fall apart. So hopefully switching out with the dowels will make this repair last quite a long time. For the top part, same process. I'm just going to glue the dowels into those bottom stretchers for the legs, put glue into the holes that were already in the legs. I didn't really have to do any. I had some glue squeeze out, go into those holes, so I had to drill them out a little bit, but in general I didn't mess with those. And then I can attach these. All I did for this was I lined them up with the pre-existing stain marks on the base of the table. I clamped them into place, and I knew that they were perfectly aligned based on those marks. I made sure to remove the glue as much as possible so I don't have to sand that on the bottom. And like I said, if I move this, you can see that it lines up perfectly with where they used to be. For the casing that holds the drawer, I'm also replacing this with dowels instead of screws, and that is because the main portion of this table is particle board. So that is just not going to hold hardware well, but it will hold dowels. So this was very simple. All the marks were already there for me because this had been originally screwed into the bottom of the table. So I just went around and re-drilled those holes, making sure not to go deep enough to go through the top, and then I could just fill them in with 1/4 inch dowel pins. And then once I had the dowel pins in the base, I could put a bunch of glue on everything. This is particle board, and the frame is plywood, so it's not going to move around on me a ton. So I can glue this on there, and all of the holes lined up because they were already pre-drilled for me. So there wasn't a lot of figuring or fitting with this. I just drilled through the holes that were already there. I could hammer this down, and now that was permanently attached as well. For the table legs, I did end up putting screws into the top for those. I don't think I filmed it instead of dowels, just because it doesn't need a ton to connect the top to the base. The finish for this is a water-based finish. I don't use water-based finishes a lot, but I had just finished another project where I'd use this, and I had enough left to do a piece like this. And to be perfectly honest, I wanted to see how long the wear and tear on a water-based finish is going to be, because I usually prefer oil. In between coats, I sanded this very lightly with fine grit sandpaper, and I put on 3 coats. And this is what it looks like once everything was said and done.